Sometimes, we find ourselves in places where the usual rules of reality seem to bend. We think we understand the world around us, but there are moments that shake that certainty. What happened to me one evening, walking along a rural road, was one of those moments, a quiet encounter with something I still can't fully explain.
My name is Bart. I've always loved the quiet and isolation of country roads, especially when I need to clear my head. There's something peaceful about walking down a long stretch of road, surrounded by fields and trees that seem to go on forever. But one night, something happened to me that I've never been able to shake off. It was the kind of thing that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world, and even now, years later, I still don't have an explanation. It was late autumn, and the air had that crisp chill that makes the leaves crunch underfoot. I was walking down a narrow country road, the kind that stretches for miles with barely any traffic. The sun had already set, and the world was bathed in the kind of darkness you only find away from city lights. I'd been walking for over an hour. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I hadn't planned on walking this far, but something about the solitude felt right. The road I was on is the kind that takes you deep into rural areas. On one side were thick woods that seemed to stretch on for miles. On the other side, there were old farmhouses, some abandoned, some still lived in, their lights flickering faintly through the windows. There wasn't much of a moon that night, so the darkness felt almost suffocating. I kept walking, lost in my thoughts, when I noticed something strange. Up ahead, maybe a quarter of a mile away, there was a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a person, maybe someone else out for a walk or working late on a farm. But as I got closer, something didn't sit right. The figure was too still, too silent. No movement, no indication that they were alive. I'm not the type to get spooked easily, but I started to feel uneasy. I slowed my pace, trying to make out more details. The figure appeared to be wearing something dark, like a long coat, but it was hard to tell because of how the darkness swallowed everything around it. There was no sound, just an overwhelming quiet. As I got even closer, my heart started to race. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of what seemed to be a person, but it felt wrong. There was no reflection of light in their eyes, no warmth in their posture. It was like looking at a shadow that wasn't attached to anything. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to turn back, but the other part urged me forward. Maybe it was just a weird feeling from being alone in such an isolated place for too long, I thought. But as I took a few more steps, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. There was a small, faint glow from the woods on the other side of the road. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of my own flashlight, but when I looked, the glow was moving. It wasn't like a flashlight beam, it was soft, almost like the glow of a lantern, but it flickered strangely, as if it was coming from something alive, but not quite human. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen, like I couldn't move. I forced myself to look back at the figure by the side of the road, but it had moved. Not in a way that you'd expect from a person, though. There was no step, no shift in posture. One moment it was standing, and the next, it was just there, but not where it had been. Closer. Maybe only 10 feet from where I was now, but still in the shadows. I couldn't explain how it happened. It was as if the figure had simply blinked into a new position, and for some reason, that was worse than if it had moved normally. I should have turned back then, I know that now. But I kept walking, my feet moving against my will, and my eyes darting between the figure and the strange light in the woods. My thoughts were a mess, trying to understand what was happening, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I got closer to the figure, I could finally make out more details. The coat, or whatever it was, looked ragged, torn in places, like it had been weathered by time. The edges of it seemed to melt into the night, like they were being absorbed by the darkness. And the air around it felt colder, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. My breath came out in clouds, visible in the air, but I didn't feel the chill on my skin. It was a cold I couldn't touch, but I could feel it deep inside me. I had no idea why, but I called out. Not to the figure, but more to the empty road. "Hello?" My voice echoed, but it felt like it was swallowed by the vastness around me. No answer. But the glow from the woods? It was getting brighter. And now, it wasn't just flickering, it was pulsating, like it was alive, like it was drawing closer. And that's when I heard it. A sound I can't quite explain. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a low, humming noise, like a chant or a whisper carried on the wind. It was coming from the woods, from the direction of the light, and it seemed to be growing louder the closer I got. That's when I ran. My legs finally moved, and I didn't stop until I was out of that stretch of road, back near the last house I'd passed. I didn't look back. I just ran. When I finally reached my car, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I drove home, shaken, not looking in my rearview mirror once, afraid I might see something I couldn't explain. The next day, I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I still couldn't explain what I'd seen or heard. I went back to the road a few days later, hoping to make sense of it, but there was nothing. No figure, no strange glow in the woods. It was just the same quiet road, as if nothing had happened. To this day, I don't know what that was. A trick of the light? A figure from my imagination? Or something else? I'll never really know. But every time I think back to that night, I feel that cold again, and I can't shake the feeling that there's something out there on those roads, something I'm not meant to understand. Story 2. My name is Gene. I've always been a practical person, someone who doesn't easily get caught up in rumors or ghost stories. But the experience I had one night on a desolate country road still haunts me to this day, and I have no logical explanation for what happened. It was early spring, and the weather was unpredictable. One minute, the sun would break through the clouds, and the next, a downpour would start out of nowhere. I had been driving around the outskirts of a small town, a place where the roads are barely wide enough for two cars, lined by dense patches of woods and old, crumbling stone fences. I didn't have a specific destination in mind. I just wanted to clear my head, get away from the noise of everyday life for a while. I parked my car near an old dirt road that branched off the main highway. It was one of those roads where, if you didn't know it was there, you could easily miss it, tucked between overgrown hedges and a few dilapidated barns. I didn't have any particular reason to walk down that path, but something about the quiet, the stillness, drew me in. I decided to go for a short walk. The air was damp, and the smell of wet earth mixed with the faint scent of pine trees. The clouds were thick, hanging low in the sky, and the shadows cast by the overhanging branches seemed deeper than usual. My footsteps were the only sound, crunching through the gravel and dirt. The further I walked, the more the world around me seemed to close in. There was no sign of other people, no other cars on the road. I was alone. After about 20 minutes of walking, I came to a stretch of road where the woods on either side seemed to grow even denser. I noticed a strange change in the air, like the temperature had dropped suddenly, though I hadn't felt it on my skin. My breath came out in misty puffs, even though it wasn't that cold. That's when I first heard it. A faint sound, like the rustling of leaves, but it wasn't from the trees around me. It came from further ahead, deeper into the woods. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something larger moving through the underbrush. But then, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There was a figure up ahead, standing just off the road. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could tell it was tall, and from the way it stood so perfectly still, it didn't seem human. At first, I thought it was someone just standing there, maybe waiting for a ride or taking a break from walking. But there was something wrong about the way it moved, or rather, the way it didn't move. There was no shift, no subtle movement, nothing that would indicate it was alive. It was as if it was frozen in place, waiting for something. I stopped walking, feeling a growing unease in my chest. I should have turned back right then, but curiosity kept me going. As I took a few steps closer, the figure didn't react. It remained motionless. It was wearing something dark, maybe a coat, but it looked as though it blended in with the surroundings, like it wasn't quite part of the scene. I didn't know how to explain it, but the air around it felt thicker, colder, somehow. I called out, "Hey, you all right?" My voice sounded too loud in the silence, but there was no response. That's when the sound came again. A soft rustling from the woods, but this time, it was closer. Too close. I turned quickly, half expecting to see some animal or another person walking toward me, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty road behind me. I could feel my pulse quickening, but I forced myself to keep walking toward the figure. I was trying to convince myself it was just someone lost or maybe a hiker, though I knew deep down it didn't feel right. When I was only a few feet away, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't casting a shadow. I stepped back without even thinking, my feet shuffling in the gravel. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My eyes were fixed on the figure, and for a split second, I could have sworn it had moved, but not in the way a person moves. It shifted, but it wasn't a step. It was more like it folded into the new position, as though it had never been in the first place. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I turned to leave, but then I heard it. A soft, faint voice, almost a whisper, but it wasn't a language I recognized. It wasn't even something I could understand. It was more like a rhythm, a chant, or a song that was drifting from the woods, swirling in the air, but it wasn't coming from anywhere specific. I didn't hesitate any longer. I ran. I don't remember much of the next few minutes. I just remember running back down the road, my breath ragged, my feet stumbling over the gravel. I didn't dare look behind me, though the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like something was right there, close enough to touch. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the door shut and started the engine without a second thought. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the middle of the road. The next day, I returned to the spot where I'd seen it. The road was exactly the same, empty, quiet, untouched. No trace of anything unusual. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something I couldn't explain. There were no other cars around, no sign of anyone else. Just the same empty, winding path through the trees. Even now, whenever I pass that road, I feel the chill in the air, and I can't help but glance nervously at the woods. I've never told anyone about what happened that night. I'm not sure they'd believe me. But I know what I saw, and what I didn't see, and it still lingers with me, like a shadow that never quite leaves. I don't know what it was, but I know one thing for sure, I'll never walk that road alone again. To this day, I don't know what that was or if I'll ever find an answer. What I do know is that some roads are better left unexplored, and some encounters are best forgotten, before they come looking for you again.